Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the final and one of the most exciting panels of the day. We have approached several aspects of the economic consequences of war, but now we are looking at the financial and the humane impacts and the costs of the conflict. And for this final panel discussion, please welcome our moderator, Dr. Balázs Szepesi, who heads MCC School of Economics. So please give a warm round of applause to our presenters. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. This is the Friday Prophecy Show. Welcome our great prophets, Dr. Corrado Macchiarelli. He's from London. He's research manager for Global Macroeconomic National Institute of Economic and Social Research. Was it perfect? Thank you. Olga Pindyuk. She's from Vienna, from the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies. Rácz Orsolya. She's from Pozsony. She's Deputy Director of Globsec Policy Institute. And Professor Guillaume Vignier. He's from AJC Paris, Associate Professor. And our task for this afternoon to understand what does the war makes with the economy. In general, I think that it's important to make notes and in hopefully one, more realistically 2 or 3 years to look back what was true from the vision that we collected here together in Friday afternoon. As I told to the panelists, I am very curious about 2 main issues: where we will blow up and what will be after, how the world will look like when there will be peace again. We have a lot of questions with the precise methodology of economists to pass through. And let me start with the very basic question that what's your view? What are the most important channels between the war and the economy in general? And please focus not on the straightforward ones that we spoke already today, like energy and food, but those other tricky stuffs that go under the earth. So let's go around. I give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. So first of all, so we did analyze the effect of the war a while ago, a few months in since the invasion in February. And in doing so, we used the National Institute, which is the institution where I come from. We have a sort of econometric global model that we use to look at the transmission channels of different shocks, and that was also the case when we tried to quantify the effect of the war. Now, in terms of the channel, of course, we touched upon and actually discussed quite extensively before the effect of food price inflation, commodity, and this is obviously feeding into higher inflation. So I think the number one cost of the war is really inflation, but I think while the sort of first round effect is inflation, there is also several second rounds effect. I mean, one of them is that, of course, this is squeezing households' income in real terms, and this is something that we have observed across the board. I mean, in the UK as well as many other advanced economy. Now, the fact that there's been a squeeze in real income might be obvious, but of course, there are 2 elements to that. One is that, of course, that has warrant a monetary policy response, which of course is creating, because of the nature of the shock, we've said before in Europe, is mainly supply side driven, mainly commodity prices feeding into inflation. So because of the nature of the shock, this is creating a very dangerous trade-offs for central bankers that have to decide whether to sort of stabilize price inflation or exert a recession. So for the time being, of course, many central banks in advanced economy have engaged in a sort of chest-beating exercise in which brings inflation faster close to 2%, but of course this is coming at a cost for the economy. So I think the fact that we enter a monetary policy tightening cycle, particularly in advanced economy, we started talking about quantitative tightening, and this is happening after more than a decade of quantitative easing, of course, is something that we will have to consider going forward, because we are entering sort of a new phase in which interest rates will be higher, inflation will be higher, there will be questions about debt sustainability. And those, while I appreciate the not direct costs to the war, they're anyway sort of direct consequences of having inflation which is as high as double digit, which is something that, if one would have asked us even a couple of years ago, if you would have asked a Federal Reserve official or ECB official or Bank of England official, could you imagine 10% inflation, they would have said, no way. But this had happened. And of course, it has happened as a result of the war, but let's not forget that the war came after a very difficult period in which supply chains were already disrupted after the pandemic. So of course, it was one shock hitting as the global economy was recovering. So in that sense, the amplification effect was quite detrimental. Nevertheless, so the inflation effect that we quantified in the very early stages of the war, comparing our sort of February forecast with the forecast that we had over the summer, was that was more or less adding 2% to global inflation in terms of costs. Of course, those estimates have been revised. They keep changing. Now it's very even difficult to sort of put a finger on a number of inflation because of what's going on in terms of monetary policy. Now, the other effect, of course, is the real cost to the economy. And that has resulted, again, based on our previous estimates, in a loss to global GDP of about $1.5 trillion. So a huge cost to the global economy. This is the result of a mixed combination of factors, of course, loss of confidence, increasing risk, the squeeze in demand through lower real incomes, as we've mentioned, financial risks, exchange rate risks that I'm happy to touch upon later, and overall, so this is roughly a bit more, was a bit more than 1 percentage point of global GDP. So this is quite important. To these, of course, we also have to add the effect of trade restrictions, because, of course, the sanctions also acting in the form of trade restrictions have contributed also to lower the global GDP figures. And so this is really what are, I think, the main transmission channels on the demand side, if we look at the negative effect of the war. Of course, there was also some positive, if you want, when we do the sort of growth accounting exercise for the war. One of them is, of course, increasing in public expenditure for refugees. That was, of course, the case for a lot of neighboring countries that are neighboring Ukraine. But, of course, this effect was not substantial and not enough to cushion the negative effect of the war, as well as increasing revenue from commodity exporters for the global economy. So probably Russia will not see much of that because it's kind of functioning now because of the sanction as sort of autocracy. But we have seen through the simulations in NIGEM, which is our global econometric model, that commodity exporters such as Argentina, Brazil, Mexico would somehow benefit from higher commodity prices. So of course those are pluses. So those are elements that would add in a sense to global growth, but again, that would not be nearly enough to compensate for the negative effect of the war. So this, when it comes to the demand side transmission channels, there are also some supply side channels effect of the war. We've mentioned already in the previous panels. Of course, the technological bans are playing negatively in this respect. Supply chain disruptions, increase in intermediate and input goods. And so those are all, and of course, commodity prices, higher commodity prices themselves. So those are all effect in terms of supply side. So it's a combination of demand and supply forces coming into play. Very much agree with the fact that, of course, in Europe it is more of a supply side sort of issue, which is creating more significant trade-offs, which also explained why the European Central Bank was late in the game, compared to other central banks, whereas in the US is a bit more of a balanced combination of factors across demand and supply. So I'll probably stop here as far as the transmission is concerned.
Okay, I would like to zoom into Europe more, talking about the effects of war, and I think there are clear differences we can observe between the countries depending on how rich the countries are. The poorer the countries, the more vulnerable they are to the crisis. And also those countries which are the members of the EU, they actually have an advantage in the situation because they can, they're much better positioned to provide some fiscal stimulus. They have access to EU emergency financing, which countries which are outside the EU do not. Yeah, looking at the distributional effects of the crisis. So it's the poorer countries and the poorer households. The higher the share of food and energy in consumption of households, the more affected they are. So we are talking now about increase in poverty levels across Europe. The more farther east, the higher the increase is supposed to be. And there is a need of a fiscal policy to counteract, to offset this negative effect, to cushion the blow to the households. How much ability the governments have to do that, that's a question. It's really becomes even more difficult with interest rates rising. You know, there is a run on emerging markets, and you cannot use funds of the emergency financing. You cannot really borrow externally. What are you left with? Not much. And I think the households in countries outside the EU, which they will be really strongly affected. Another aspect I wanted to look at, you talked about refugees briefly in passing, but this probably can have a significant effect in the medium run on the economies. I mean, abstracting from Ukraine, where that's obviously felt very strongly, given the demographic issues, Europe is going through this influx of relatively highly educated refugees from Ukraine can provide some partial solution to the demographic issues Europe has, provided they stay and there are proactive policies of their integration into job markets. So this is some kind of silver lining. And another silver lining of the situation is fast move towards green transition and energy-saving technologies. Countries are now forced to do that. So in the short run, we all heard how much shock it is. We all know how painful it is. But probably in a couple of years, we will start to see some positive effects of this rapid change. And yet another transmission channel is through investment. So countries which are bordering Russia and Ukraine, they are now perceived as somewhat riskier from political point of view. So we already can see a lot of anecdotal evidence, and already shows up even in some statistics. There is much less interest of foreign direct investors in some countries of the Central Eastern Europe because of that. And this is likely to stay like that unless there is the end of the war, which is satisfactory and creates like a long-run stable solution, you know, to have to coexist with Russia. Yeah, I think that's it for me.
Thank you very much for your kind invitation. So let me dive into a little bit on concretely focus down to Ukraine, what's happening in the war-torn country. So basically, unfortunately, the war overtakes the whole economy, which includes, for example, production. There are main shifts in the production that is supposed to, first of all, service the war, and second of all, address the humanitarian needs that this country has to face now. So I think this is some key structural changes in the economy that are completely reshaping how the country is functioning right now. And of course, if we are talking about the economy and specifically Ukraine's case, the physical part of the economy in terms of the infrastructure, the factories, many of that has been damaged, especially in the eastern, northeastern and southeastern territories. So even if we are just talking about Ukraine, there are big differences between which part of the country we are talking about. So definitely the suffering has been more severe there, where basically people are fighting for their survival. So that's one point that I wanted to mention is how the economy, how the especially production and infrastructure has been impacted. And there are, during wartime, of course, necessary new spendings that the country hasn't been counted with, which of course will have an impact on the GDP. Naturally, more increased defense spending. Of course, this can be set for Europe as well, but maybe that's a bigger topic to open now, and address the humanitarian needs as well. And there is another kind of impact that I wanted to mention is the psychological distress. That is a key part of what's happening right now. We can count with even irreversible psychological damage in some cases, which will have, I think, long-term impacts. As well as in certain parts of the country, there is an education crisis because there are simply schools that have been completely destroyed and education has been stopped. So I think that will have impacts as well. Of course, I mean, I don't want to go into detail about the psychological and these impacts because I believe we will cover them later. I just sort of wanted to kind of mention that these are important factors as well. Maybe I'll stop now then.
Okay, so thanks for having me. So what I'm going to talk is about three things essentially. First of all, I think that we've been living over the past few decades an area clearly marked by free trade, and we have seen very clearly some advantages of free trade in terms of specialization of countries and so on. But somehow, for a few decades, we didn't really see the costs of those free trade policies. And I think now we are starting seeing the costs, and there are three main costs that the war allows us to see. The first one is probably the most obvious, which is the one that was somehow discussed in the panels on food and on energy, is the fragility of supply chains. Somehow we have become extremely reliant on very long supply chains, very complex supply chains. And of course, disruptions of supply chains can be extremely costly. They can be costly, of course, because of shortages, but also because of delays. All the supply chains rely really on in-time arrival and departures of goods and services, and any delay, of course, is extremely costly. There is also something else which is less obvious and a lot less mentioned, which is related to inflation. There are several causes to inflation. I will come back to that, but one part of it, of course, is just shortages. You have less goods, less energy, so prices go up, but there is something else. I recently did some, I think, interesting calculations for France, but I think they would hold for all European countries. If you look at the past 20 years, official inflation rates looked relatively mild, between 0 and 2% per year, essentially. And at least in the case of France, if you look at official inflation over the past 25 years, it's about 25%. Okay. Now, if you break down these figures between goods that are, and services which are produced locally, meaning in France, and goods and services which could be moved to China or could be moved to other parts of the world, then it's very interesting. Goods and services which you cannot move to some other part of the world, like, I don't know, haircuts or something like that, prices have gone up by 50%. And if you look at goods which you can move somewhere else in the world, prices have been stable, and there was absolutely zero inflation over the past 20 to 25 years. Which means that somehow inflation was hidden for 25 years, not because prices didn't go up too much, but just because we were able to move goods and to buy goods from further and further away from countries with lower wages, lower prices, and so on. And so somehow, of course, as soon as those long supply chains get disrupted, this hidden inflation is coming back, and if at some point we have to bring back some production more local, well, that's going to translate into somewhat higher prices. So that's, I think, one interesting take on inflation. The second fragility that was hidden coming from free trade is, well, in a sense, international trade has to rely on payment systems. Okay, and until very recently, most of the payments in the world were processed through the SWIFT payment system, so the international payment system that allows payments between banks in many different countries. And historically, SWIFT was located in Belgium, a country which is not a superpower, and a country which was supposed, and with a governance which was supposed to be neutral relative to political powers. What has happened already a little bit after 9/11, a lot more over the past decade, and a lot more since February, is the politicization of payment systems. And of course, with the sanctions and with Russia being excluded, or most Russian banks being excluded from SWIFT, means that this quasi-unique payment system, which was supporting free trade, now will not work anymore as a unique payment system for the world. And what we are starting to see, and well, of course, some countries like China and Russia had anticipated this to some extent, is a fragmentation of payment systems in the world, which is extremely important because it's really a key infrastructure of any economy. Okay? And we had one, now we may have several of them, and that's going to be probably very important for the future with a lot of political implications. For example, what are European countries going to do? Are they going to all have to stay with SWIFT, which is increasingly controlled and monitored by the US? Will they have to think about their own payment infrastructures? Will they have to go for something else? That's going to be a critical thing. Of course, related to that is the issue, which I think is very important, of the role of the dollar going forward and the potential de-dollarization we may see. In the sense that somehow the absolutely key role of the dollar in the international payment system and in the international trade system, just to give you one figure, the US imports and exports are about 13% of all trade worldwide, but payments in dollar in the international trade is about 60 to 65%. So many countries which are not related to the US, or most of the trade which is not related to the US, uses dollar for payments. And clearly, the politicization of payment systems and the potential fragmentation of payment systems may have an implications for the international role of the dollar, which we may want to discuss further. And the third thing I want to discuss is, of course, as we have been increasingly reliant on free trade and globalization over the past few decades, we have been increasingly reliant or dependent on exchange rates. Of course, if we import and export a very large share of our GDP, well, any small change in exchange rate has a much bigger impact on our own local economy. And that's, of course, extremely relevant for today. We've seen the euro somehow collapsing, or at least decreasing a lot relative to the dollar. Same thing for the Hungarian forint. And of course, it means that, well, a lot of the inflation we are seeing is not directly related to the monetary policy of the ECB. It's really related to this fall in the exchange rate, which means that whatever we buy from abroad, starting from oil and from other forms of energy, we pay it much, like 20% or 30% more than what we used to a year ago. And so this dependence on exchange rate, again, is something we may want to reconsider going forward. And my Italian colleague started to mention the role of the ECB. I think clearly that's now the very difficult path for the ECB is to find a way between trying to support the euro by raising interest rates and support the exchange rate of the euro by raising interest rates, but that's of course extremely risky. Governments are heavily indebted, firms are heavily indebted. Firms typically borrow with floating exchange rate, which is not always the case of households. It depends a lot on in which country you are. But so here there is really the risk that if rates go up, households and firms and even governments may be hurt a lot, and so that's going to be a key policy issue for the future.
Thank you. So how to sum it up, that there is a tragedy in eastern Ukraine. Ukraine is very sad. The neighboring countries already start to feel it, even more if they're landlocked. And all Europe in trouble, and the world fears this 1% GDP fall in general. So there are concentric circles, what we spoke about till now. What are other aspects of this mapping of the effects? What do you think, what other regional differences are there in the impact of the war? What are the regional differences? And what other social differences are in the effects? Olga mentioned already the poor-rich dimension. So who is a little bit worse off and who is extremely worse off because of the war? What do you think? Let's follow the same line.
Yes. Yeah, so I think in terms of winners and losers of the war, I mean, as I was saying, at a global scale, I think, you know, the global economy is on the losing side. There are some countries that, you know, might benefit from higher commodity prices, and those are countries that are heavily reliant on commodity exports. But, you know, on balance, definitely the global economy didn't need a war. And as I said, it came at the very wrong time for many different reasons that we touched upon. But I think, you know, the element that Guillaume was saying, it's a very interesting one, because, you know, one of the key elements of the war is that really this gives us the chance to rethink about the, you know, on the one hand, the post-Bretton Woods order that was largely dominated by the dollar and the euro on the one end, and the emergence of a multipolar system, which is basically backed by commodity exporters, which would be another equilibrium. And I think to a large degree, the way the war is evolving is suggesting that we're probably, you know, moving towards more a multipolar system, because on the one hand we have clearly an escalation of tensions, as touched in the previous panel, between the US and China, but also we have the reconfiguration of you know, big players such as Russia that of course are, you know, are coming to the center stage through, you know, through the war. So I think this will be a very important element to think about, because, you know, this new financial system will sort of have financial implications for the equilibrium that we'll have going forward. So this is at the global scale. You know, the de-dollarization issue is definitely important. I mean, one other sort of key element is that, for instance, the dollar has lost nearly 80% of parity against gold over the past 20 years. So, I mean, the dollar is, of course, gradually losing the role of world reserve currency, so as the euro. But of course, this trend, which was well enacted before the war, is something that doesn't stop with advanced economies, because, you know, countries such as China are really pushing to replace the dominance of the dollar. I mean, as of 2016, the renminbi was included in the special drawing right of the IMF. China also started to issue future contracts in yuan, so petro yuan, not long ago. So in a sense, there is a push towards that. Also, in the previous panel, they mentioned that BRIC countries are looking to settle intra-BRIC transaction in local currency versus dollars. So in a sense, there is a push and trend towards de-dollarization, and this is something, of course, that, you know, if if not a direct consequence of the war, is something that, of course, the war will accelerate and will kind of force us to think about what, you know, sort of global order we're gonna move towards to. So this is a global scale. At the local scale, what I can say is that, I mean, my colleagues at the National Institute have been working extensively on the impact that the war is having on a given set of households, and you know, one of the main conclusions is, of course, the fraction of households which we classify as in destitution, so that basically will move from one month to the other without any savings, has increased substantially. There is only so much that fiscal policy has done to cushion the effect. I mean, not looking at the sort of last Friday budget, but, you know, up until then, there is only so much a fiscal policy has done. And of course, I think we will have to think about the cost to the economy and the fact that, of course, this is risking pushing a lot of households into poverty, particularly those who have low savings, that have used their savings already during the pandemic or since the pandemic to kind of support their consumption, given, you know, lockdowns and sort of forced you know, closures of the economy. So I think these are all questions that we'll have to reconsider going forward, and yeah, definitely consequences of the war one way or another.
Okay. But I personally think that, you know, the talk about de-dollarization is grossly exaggerated. We are talking since many decades about, you know, dollar losing its role as a reserve currency, but actually we haven't observed anything of this kind, and recently there is a stronger demand for dollar. You know, everyone still wants to run for dollar in crisis times. It's like a safe harbor, safe haven currency. There are these regional initiatives which you mentioned about, you know, China, etc., but they do not really cause any significant changes in the forex reserve structures of the central banks across the world. Everyone prefers dollar, second best euro. Not many central banks are ready to, you know, buy yuan and keep to have it as a forex a currency for their international reserves. And talking about multipolar world, so actually it seems like Russia, what Russia has achieved with this war, it has been the opposite of all the goals they had. Now it's more and more probable that the role of Russia in the global economy or geopolitical arena will be marginalized. You know, what the war has demonstrated that Russia doesn't have much of military capacity. Russia doesn't have any high-tech industry. It relies heavily on Western technologies, and without access to parts and components and computer chips, many industries in Russia just stop functioning. Like, you know, car manufacturing now has basically collapsed. It's minus 90% of the usual output is being produced, and there are quite a few sectors which show similar trends. We do not see it like on the macro level yet, because you can still, you know, for a while you have this inertia of higher oil prices, but oil prices since the mid of June are going down globally, and this is very much felt by the Russian economy. In August there was huge fiscal deficit in Russia, which is unprecedented, and you know, their expenses are rising to finance the war. Incomes are falling. What do you do in this situation? It seems like it's Russia's international allies, which were much more supportive at the beginning of the war. You know, when the predictions were across the board that the war will be short, Russia will manage to conquer Ukraine quite fast, they didn't really come true. It was shown how weak actually Russian army is, and we see clear signs of China and India now distancing from Russia. We also see many Chinese companies not wanting to export to Russia, and this is their own decision, because Russian market is not big enough for them to risk American sanctions. That's where the most income lies. Yeah, so I think yeah, the chances of having multipolar world somewhat decreased with the war now. And yeah, talking about inflation, actually what I wanted to mention is quite interesting that oil prices and food prices, they have been growing prior to the war because there was unilateral decrease in export supplies of gas by Russia. That fueled inflation already in 2021. And there is a lot of critique of the ECB in this respect, that they didn't react fast enough and they let it, their monetary policy be accommodative, though already in December inflation was at 5%. This shows a lot about the reliability of Russia's energy supplier, about energy security being compromised in the EU due to some wrong decisions being historically made. But now I think this is all obvious, and a point of no return has been crossed. So I think what will happen, Russian economy will be isolated for quite a few years until there are some major changes happening there politically. And the companies which left Russia, quite many of them, they will not return for quite a while. And there will be this trend of friendshoring. That's a new term being coined now. When the COVID started, we were talking about nearshoring, reshoring, and now we're talking about friendshoring, that the countries will be, the investors will be taking into account political risks much stronger. And this also actually affects China. China's economy has been doing not so well recently, and with tensions with the US growing, I think you can already notice in the data there is much less interest of investors to go there. There is quite a slump in foreign direct investment going to China. So I think, the future probably will not be that bad. We just need to pull through these difficult times. Thank you.
So in my opinion, when it comes to who is the most affected, those who are more reliant on the commodities from Russia and Ukraine, of course, and those countries whose import-export relations are the closest with the countries in question. So, of course, Central Eastern Europe is very heavily impacted as well because of its energy reliance, for example. We are seeing it quite clearly, but also the Baltic countries as well, who have been in close trade relations with Ukraine, for example. When it comes to the sectors, so for example, we have to take into account that we were heading into a post-pandemic recovery time. So there are already sectors and companies who have been greatly damaged and impacted. So for example, small and medium enterprises who have been suffering during the pandemic and now will be very vulnerable to high energy prices and high inflation. So I think there will definitely be a very visible impact, but also looking at the automotive industry, for example, also very heavily impacted both by supply chain disruptions, then by COVID pandemic, and now the war. For example, many of the German automotive companies have production in Ukraine, which in some cases has completely stopped. So that had an impact on production and pricing as well. And of course, the travel and leisure industry has been very heavily hurt by the pandemic, and it will probably be hurt even more during the war as well. So when it comes to a social group, which I believe was mentioned, so when it comes to our colleagues at GlobSec who are based in Ukraine have been working on identifying which sectors and which social groups are potentially the most vulnerable or impacted, and they have come to the conclusion that the war basically has really shown who the vulnerable social categories of the population are in Ukraine, and these are the elderly people, people with disabilities, people with low-income households, and people with dependents, as well as internally displaced people. There is a huge number of internally displaced people just within Ukraine, so not even counting the refugees outside of Ukraine. And of course, small businesses and small farmers who have been greatly impacted by the war, as well as personnel and residents of those regions where effectively production or economic life has stopped. So in general, we can say that there is a poverty on the rise across the country, and that in combination with the already mentioned education crisis and mental health issues will have long-term impact. Thank you very much.
So to make a few comments on these redistributive effects. So first, I think at the global level, so I think what, as I said before, we are seeing the rise of a multipolar order. And if we think about winners and losers, where clearly the Europe is weakened, and it has been said earlier in previous panels, I think, that the main winners were the US and China. For China, I would fully agree. For the US, I'm a bit more skeptical in the long term. So I think there are things in which the US benefit quite a lot, and dimensions in which they may be weakened going forward. So typically, for example, on the energy dimension, they benefit a lot. A lot of the energy we no longer receive from Russia is going to come from shale oil in the US, from LNG and so on. So we are going to buy a lot more from the US. In that sense, they will benefit. I want to come back to this issue of the role of the dollar and potential de-dollarization. I agree that we are not seeing it right now, and that the dollar is still the main global safe assets and still vastly dominant. If you look at global reserves, foreign exchange reserves of central banks, about 60 to 65% is still US dollar, and it has been actually relatively stable over the past few decades. If anything, we have had more and more countries anchoring their currency to the US dollar over the past few decades. This process may be stopping, but it's still there, of course. There are still some fragilities which the US are starting to worry about, and there are two of them. The first one, which is very interesting, is what we call shadow anchoring for the renminbi, for the yuan. What is the idea? The idea is the following. Until today, until very recently, the Bank of China was acting so that the renminbi remains almost at parity with the US dollar, or fluctuated very little relative to the US dollar. So if you are a global investor, holding the renminbi or holding US dollars is almost equivalent in terms of returns. And of course, the dollar is much easier to find because you can find it at any bank, while renminbi you cannot find that because well, there are capital controls and there is no internationalization of the renminbi so far. Even so, as was said, the Bank of China is taking some steps to internationalize the renminbi. But what the Fed or what the US worry about is the idea that, well, perhaps, you know, people would like to hold renminbi, but because renminbi is almost the same as dollars, they just buy dollar at the moment. But what if in the future, the Bank of China changes policy and no longer anchors the renminbi to the dollar? Will people continue buying dollars, or will they turn from dollars to renminbis? And the worry is therefore that, well, when people buy dollar, what they truly want to buy is renminbi, which is anchored to the dollar. So that's, I think, really, and we don't know the answer. Well, actually, we know part of the answer is that in Southeast Asia, we have observed the following. Over the past few years, the Bank of China, the Central Bank of China, let the renminbi fluctuate a little more relative to the dollar than in the past. So the two currencies became a little more decorrelated. And what we saw is that some central banks in Southeast Asia started to move a little bit towards renminbi. So this suggests that this shadow anchoring is going on to some extent. To what extent, it's impossible to say, but that's potentially one threat, is that if one day the Bank of China decorrelates the renminbi from the US dollar, then we may see a much bigger move in terms of reserves compared to anything we have seen so far. The second issue the US are worried about is the issue of central bank digital currencies. At the moment, all the currencies we have, at least in Europe, for example, is payments that are processed through commercial banks. Okay. In China is leading the way towards what we call central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, which are payment systems processed no longer through commercial banks, but directly through accounts held by all of us at the central bank. And China is really leading the way globally in terms of this CBDC, has infrastructures which are already functioning for a digital renminbi, and the US or Europe are lagging behind. Actually, the Fed announced 2 weeks ago that it would work more intensively on a digital dollar. The European Central Bank last week or 10 days ago announced a working group on the digital euro. But there is really a fear that going forward, money would no longer, or at least not to the same extent, go through interbank payments, but go through central bank infrastructures, and that China could have an advantage. So there are questions which are very difficult, but that could move the monetary landscape in the future. And just a final word in terms of like within euro inequalities, well, I think the situation is very different across European countries. In particular, I mean, some countries used to be massive exporters or massive importers. Clearly, the exchange rate moves is going to affect very differentially countries which used to be exporting countries or importing countries. Countries also differ quite a lot in terms of energy sources. In France, we have a lot of nuclear energy, and so to some extent, that's hedged as opposed to countries which don't have nuclear energy so far. So there is heterogeneity that we may want to discuss further. Yeah.
Thank you. Let's imagine a history book in 2050, and there would be a chapter that war had serious economic consequences, and there would be a list of economic catastrophes. When the economy broke down, that had serious social and political consequences. What do you think? What will be this list of economic catastrophes in this 2050 history book?
I mean, just for sake of continuity, and I think I don't know if this can be labeled as an economic catastrophe, but definitely, something we have to be aware of, and not something that I would necessarily have an answer to. But I think we all agree that, of course, the de-dollarization, if it will happen very slowly. I mean, still, the dollar is the world reserve currency by and large. I think on the central bank digital currency, I totally agree that this is an element to look at, but I think this will probably affect the speed of the transition to a new sort of order. Would not, I think, help reconfigure the order itself. I think the order, if there would be a new order away from sort of the Bretton Woods, so dollar-denominated one, that would be determined by geopolitics. I don't think necessarily by technology. I think technology might affect the speed to which we will transition to that. But I think one major danger now, which will probably bear consequences over the medium term, would be really the role of monetary policy and how sort of monetary policy, or should, let's say, monetary policy coordinate or not, in the sense that I think part of the previous discussion by my colleagues was, really hinting at the fact that clearly, we have entering a cycle of, very strong dollar, super dollar, because of course the Fed aggressive tightening. Now we've seen other central banks, such as the Bank of England, the ECB, that of course have been prompted to tighten as well. Of course, I mean that was also not only to respond to, regional economic conditions, but also to some extent, and perhaps not directly, but also to avoid that the currency would slide too much against the US dollar. So this is really reminiscent of sort of a reverse currency war. I mean, we also have seen in the case of China, I mean, China has been the counterpoint in the global tightening cycle, but they gave in recently to the idea of tightening policy, although marginally, moderately. And, you know, China, I mean, is not a country that is facing high inflation. I mean, quite the contrary. Again, this is to avoid the yuan to slide too much against the dollar. So I think, you know, there is really the looming idea of a sort of reverse currency war, and I think, you know, this is something that probably would be, you know, a major, you know, sort of major disaster, if you want to call it like that, because of course that would be very detrimental to global trade and mainly to global trade. So I think that the main question to me is really to which extent sort of the, you know, exiting the ultra accommodative monetary policy stimulus that we have put in place as the result of the global financial crisis and then the pandemic will have to be coordinated or not. And I think it's not yet clear to me whether coordination or versus not coordination will be more costly. I think there are two, you know, we were saying before, you know, two-handed economies. So on the one hand, I think we you know, there is a school of thought that believes that monetary policy should not coordinate, and I think the World Bank has been leading that because, of course, there would be, I mean, they believe higher costs in terms of global recession, whereas there are other economists who believe that coordination should be indeed the way forward, and I wouldn't have an answer to that.
I think probably the catastrophes, if they happen, they probably will be not so linked so much to the war, but to all the mistakes the governments made prior to and along the way. You know, quantitative easing. This is now quite a big issue being discussed because of the way it was done and how much money was just thrown to the economies in the hope of them trickling down. What happened instead that they went into speculative assets to a large extent, and now this really makes soft landing from the high inflation so problematic. This is like a major reason for many central banks have to manage this high inflation, have to solve this issue because it's too much cash around, and have to deflate these bubbles in a slow way. That's always a tricky question. And I think so far, like, the biggest mistakes are probably made. Like, the UK government is quite champion, you know, Brexit, the recent tax cuts, which spooked the markets. So yeah, it's like adding oil to the fire. Turkey is also quite a special case. They have inflation already 80%, 80. So, and I think a very big question is about how the societies are run. What is the, collective agreement in the societies? Because what we are seeing now with elections in Italy and the infamous 2016 election in the US, there was this increase in far-right populist parties. They grew in popularity. This is still a trend. This is always like happens in the times of crisis. In the EU, there are quite a few countries where we also notice such changes. Decrease in democracy, the democratic institutions get destroyed, which we thought is so unlikely to happen. We have all sorted out and fixed, but no, it's actually quite reversible, it appears. So a big question is what will prevail? Will the democracy around the globe, which is not the perfect form of running societies, but nothing better was invented so far. Will it prevail or not? I think it will have very long-running implications for everyone, basically. And last but definitely not least, something we tend to forget is global climate. I mean, not we, but politicians. actually, it might as well happen that in 10 years there will be such huge global climate catastrophes that, you know, part of countries will not physically exist anymore. If you look at this UN reports forecasting what can happen given the environmental trends, this is like really depressing. And the question is whether this war can be used as a additional impulse to fight the issue of global climate as well. Maybe, you know, that will be a silver lining of all the situation.
Yeah, I'm actually really glad that you mentioned climate change, because this is something that people tend to forget about in times of crisis, because there are just simply other priorities in the short term. For example, increase the defense expenditure or other expenditure to rebuild the economy and infrastructure, and investing into green transition is very costly. It's not something that we can avoid. I think green transition has to happen. That shouldn't even be a question. But for example, the new generation small nuclear power plants are very expensive. The technology is expensive also for various renewable energy sources as well. So there is a huge investment that's needed both on a national level, but when we're talking about the EU, both from the EU level as well. So I think there's definitely a risk that this will be in the background. The other issue I wanted to mention is during the times of crisis, it's protectionism that tends to prevail instead of solidarity. In my opinion, solidarity is easier to achieve in the short term. So for example, when you look at huge refugee influxes, which happened right after the war broke out, many neighboring countries showed solidarity and adapted very quickly, both on the national as well as EU level, to activate further support. However, as time goes on, this will be very difficult to keep up, because there are just challenges sort of piling up, and we are already seeing on the political level as well that the discourse has been shifting and probably will be shifted as well. And also the pandemic is kind of has demonstrated that it's not necessarily solidarity that has prevailed when it came to distribution of vaccines, for equal distribution of vaccines, for example, or face masks, or any products that were urgently needed, but it was protectionism and country-first approach that was very visible, and that makes me quite frankly pessimistic when it comes to where we are headed. And the third thing that I wanted to mention is we have been seeing weaponization of energy, but there is also the question of weaponization of interdependence. Energy is not the only thing where we rely on other countries, but it's a range of, you know, commodities, and especially with the interconnected world, this interdependence can very easily be exploited.
So I think that whenever there is a crisis, we tend to think, well, how are we going to come back to what was there before the crisis? But that's not always the right way to see it. Perhaps we are at a point where there is a change in paradigm, and I think that's precisely where we are. And I think that somehow we've lived through a few decades of where political debates were mostly dominated by discussions on economy, on free trade, and somehow today, like, we are asking, well, are we going to come back to that? Are we going to come back to what we knew a few months ago or a few years ago? And that may not be exactly what's going to happen. There is a concept which is mounting in political science, which I think is very interesting. It's a concept of civilizational states. So we used to live in a world of, well, historically of states, then probably with lots of international organizations, and today we may see the rise of what some people in political science have called civilizational states. What is that? It's a world centered around major states and their neighboring countries, so Civilizational states could be, the US, could be Europe, could be Russia, could be Iran, could be Turkey, could be China. And in this new paradigm, it could, if of course it happens, but I tend to think it's the case, economic issues or purely economic issues, so issues of free trade and so on, are not leading issues. And it may be a world in which you mentioned the politicization of energy or the use of energy and resources for war purposes, for political purposes. In a world of civilizational states, economic resources may be used mostly not for economic purposes, but for political purposes. In a world where resources are going to be scarcer and scarcer, their use is going to be more and more political. I looked this morning, actually, I was not planning to talk about this, I looked for something else, but it's very relevant, about projections for availability of resources, of many kinds of resources over the past few decades, resources in terms of copper, in terms of tin, and so on. The global reserves are a couple of decades. It's very short, a few decades. If we look at oil, probably the oil peak has already been reached. For conventional oil, for sure. For shale oil, probably. I looked also at some interesting numbers. If we look at the oil discoveries versus oil production, meaning what we actually extract, discoveries are lower than production, was lower than production already in 1985. I was not even born. So it has been 40 years that we extract more oil than what we find. So, and we are really at a point where this exhaustion of resources is becoming extremely major. And if those resources are becoming more and more scarce, it's very unlikely that we are going to live in a world of cooperation, of free trade of resources. And I think it would be crazy to believe that. Actually, we are going to, whether we like it or not, and we may not like it, but that's like that. I think that there is going to be an increasingly political use of resources and an increasing clearing of markets or clearing of resources, not through markets, but through war and through political arrangements. And so I think that may be the major shift we are living in. So of course, that's not going to be an easy, necessarily an easy time to live with. It's going to come probably, all those shortages with some poverty and so on. But that may be the time we live in. After that, maybe one final word to say, well, there may be a positive way to look at all this. And the positive way would be to say, well, perhaps it's precisely a time where we want to find the chance to change economic model. Perhaps it's time to realize that models which we thought were extremely stable were actually fragile because they were relying on the continuing availability of everything from somewhere in the world. Okay, we don't have oil there, we can buy it from somewhere. We don't have gas here, we can buy it from somewhere else. Well, perhaps it's time to rethink economic models which are more resilient in the sense that they will have much more adequacy between what we have at the level of local territories, at the level of regions, of countries, and the kind of economic model we should have. So I think that's really the challenge for tomorrow. We can't take it as a positive channel. That's, of course, not going to be easy. Once I say this, most of the things remains to be done. But maybe that's going to be the challenge ahead of us. But I think that in any case, it's very unlikely we are going to come back to what we knew a few years ago.
You started to answer my next question. Thank you very much. I want to go to the next chapter of this history book from 2050. So the war is over. Let's imagine that this chapter is about the 30s, and the title of the chapter that the new economic order got its shape. What do you think? How this new economic order of the world that is shaped now by the COVID, by the 1 decade-long printing money, by the war, how will it look like? What will be the world where our students will start their bright career?
So I think, one element that really struck me in one of the previous panels was that from one of the sort of CEO of kind of a big energy company here in Hungary was saying that, you know, indeed our sort of first response to the crisis, to the energy crisis, has been that of essentially burning coal. So in a sense, stepping back and scrap some environmental standards that we fought for many decades to really cushion the effect of the crisis. And I really believe, and I think, you know, definitely, I mean, if we see the trend which has been pushed by younger generation, I mean, there seems to be the direction in which we are moving. And incidentally, during one of the break, one student asked, why shouldn't we nudge consumers away from meat consumption? And I think, you know, this is quite emblematic of the, I think, the transition that we will have to manage in terms of the future. So on the one hand, we'll obviously have to diversify supply. So our energy sources will have to be diversified. We will have to avoid situations in which we don't have an inbuilt resilience of our energy provision. And that echoes with the comments made by my colleagues. But on the other hand, we will also have to nudge demand away from some consumption habits which are not sustainable, not good for the planet, and need to be changed. And of course, you know, the hope is that really the war in Ukraine is kind of incidentally put an accelerator on this energy transition, but this didn't really happen. So I think Europe mostly entered in survival mode and kind of put on hold all the good purposes that they had in terms of transition for now. But really, for the long term, this should be the priority. So we should revisit our models and make our economy greener, more sustainable, more diversified. I think this is the only way forward, and you know, I think there should also be, and I think the Commission has started to move in that direction, also further regulation in sort of moving away from, you know, sort of products which are very water intensive for production purposes, very polluting. You know, we now know that livestock is extremely polluting for the atmosphere. So that has to be done through you know, the use of, you know, the means that we use, subsidies and taxes. It will not be easy because, of course, it will require a behavioral change, and as such, you know, the transition will not happen in 1 year. But definitely, this is the sort of future, and we have, you know, reports from a lot of multilateral organizations which indeed suggest that this is the way forward, and to which I very much concur.
I fully agree that has to be done. I still see this shift to coal as a very temporary thing, because I think the EU Commission, they now stressed the importance of the REPower program, and increase in carbon fuel usage, decrease in carbon fuel usage should come even shorter. They impose a like tighter deadline for themselves. Consumer behavior, I mean, not only consumers, but companies, it's a crucial thing. So now when the households and companies are really stressed because of high energy prices, it's very important to target the assistance in a careful way, not to promote you know, the same consumption of energy. There is a big scope for energy savings still to exploit. And another thing that, you know, climate change is a global issue, and there is a lot of carbon emissions being produced abroad and then imported hidden in products. So this is attempted to be regulated, but I think there needs to be a really coordination and harmonization of policies across the world for this to be successful. You know, pandemics, climate change, there are no really borders for that. So here we see the very strong need for coordination. And one more aspect is income distribution inside, you know, more affluent countries. The globalization is being criticized for many things correctly, but you know, there are big benefits of it as well, especially for the countries which got the opportunity to be integrated in global value chains. They got capital coming to their countries. They could, you know, look at China, how much success it had. But what happened in countries which outsource their production facilities, we are observing that the wealth is being accumulated stronger and stronger in a tiny proportion of people in many countries of the West. And this is also a big reason for this rise of extreme right populist tendencies, and this has to be dealt with. And again, we are coming to the need of harmonizing globally some regulation initiatives. There was this initiative about introducing minimum corporate tax supported by the OECD, and now it's being put on hold for a while, I hope. But yeah, the problem is that there are many corporations which use very loose tax regulations in some countries, and they can earn huge profits without really giving back to the society. And these are the issues which need to be dealt with. These are very tricky issues, and when it comes to global harmonization of anything, we can all be skeptical about the success of that. But we shouldn't stop trying, I think.
I fully agree. I think that probably your generation will have a big role in how to build resilience or stronger resilience through resource intensification. So that will be a key, because more geopolitical risks are to be expected in the future, even after this war. So resilience will be a key target to achieve in multiple sectors as well. And you already mentioned the issue of refugees. With refugees, and especially after the war, a key question should be how to integrate refugees. And I'm not just talking about refugees from Ukraine or Russia, but also, for example, climate refugees, which will be increasingly an issue as we are talking about climate change. So I think that integration is not dealt with in detail, and there should be strategies on how to integrate these people, both not only in the short term but medium and long term as well. And these policies should come not only from the EU level but from the country level as well. And it's, as you know, it's a very complex issue, from integration, from the language, from the culture point of view, education, job market. So it's a big task that is awaiting us in the long term.
So yeah, on the future economic regime, so I said already, I believe that we are going to move to a regime where there is an increasingly political allocation of resources. And if we want to make it nicer, I think that we really should think of how to create some adequation between territories, countries, and economic models. Actually, this is not a new thing. I'm myself working a lot in economic history. Until probably a century ago, there was this kind of adequation. There was very good reasons why in some regions you find more livestock and in some regions more certain types of crops. There was very good reasons why in some areas you eat in some ways and with some kind of regime and diet, and you do certain things. It was precisely ways to better accommodate the fact that most of the resources were coming from local sources, and there has to be always a care for the renewing of those energy sources, a care for the renewing of forests, a case for the renewing of soil. So all the exhaustible resources had to be taken care of locally, and I think that most of the problems we are facing today come from the fact that we cut this link to territories, to countries, to think that we could buy anything potentially from anywhere in the world. And today we are realizing that, well, this led to massive waste of resources, massive exhaustion of resources, and we will no longer be able to live with that. So that's a chance to really try to think positively how we can rebuild this kind of models. That's of course going to require major change in our agricultural models, in our energy sources, in our consumption styles and so on. But I think we will have no other choice than this one. And I think that positive role for governments is precisely to try to anticipate, to somehow plan this move to much more resilient economic models. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We got questions from the audience. There are 3 ones, but I think that only one of these is relevant for now. The first is, what are Putin's goals? I think it's not an economic question, so if someone has some idea, tell it, but I think that we don't have to focus it so much. The second question in the climate issues, I think that we discussed it in this round. And the third question is for Professor Guillaume, that one time you mentioned that prices are low because of the globalization. And now in the last contribution you mentioned that the world will be not so interconnected. So it means that this inflation effect of global trade will disappear?
Well, I think we will have to move to more localized economic models, to more local sourcing of resources. And so, of course, during a transition period, this is going to translate into higher prices. That's for sure. Basically, the idea is the following. Until now, essentially, we have been looking only at prices to make choices about our economic models. We've been saying, okay, look, gas is cheaper there, let's buy gas there. I recently learned that in France, for example, we fish some fish in the Atlantic, we ship it to China to have it emptied and prepared, and we bring it back to France to sell it in the supermarket 15 kilometers away from where it was fished. Okay. And why did we do that? Well, because it was cheap to do that. And so, yeah, it's much cheaper than to pay a local guy to empty the fish and prepare it and sell it locally. And basically, until now, we said, well, the only thing to look at to make decisions is prices. And whenever governments were intervening into prices, it was always a bit suspicious. You know, we were thinking, well, perhaps there is some, you know, it was suspicious. And I think now we are going to move into a world where we are going to say, well, it's not all about prices. There are other concerns to be taken care of, concerns about sustainability of resources, of the environment, sustainability of communities, of peoples, of countries, concerns about resilience of those supply chains. And so all of that means that, well, prices will no longer be the only variable we will have to look at, and so prices will be higher. That's exactly, I think, what is gonna happen. That doesn't mean, so of course we need to be careful about level and inflation, right? Inflation is about the change. So it could be that in the short term you see prices rising for some time, but it doesn't mean they will rise forever. Okay, they may rise for a few years, and then after, you know, the relative prices have adjusted, we may just end up with different price structures in the economy, but that doesn't mean that inflation will be high forever. That's a different topic. Yeah.
I just wanted to add something to that, and I very much agree with what you said. And I think, given the analysis that has been suggested, that obviously sort of a globalized world means that there is fraction of price that is sort of kept low by sort of international competition or availability of cheap labor in China to sort of clean the fish. I think if we really move back to a more localized economy, that would be nothing but paying the kind of fair price of a good. I mean, we cannot think of paying £2 to €2 a steak. I mean, this is not sustainable. It doesn't take into account the environmental costs, the water costs, the pollution costs. So we really have to move away from that, and it would not be we're paying more, but we're really paying the fair price of a good, because this availability of everything at all costs, I think, is a very dangerous sort of consumeristic view that definitely we dragged on for probably way too long, and definitely this generation, I mean, from this generation onwards, we will have to change if we want to have something that, of course, a world that would not be completely ruined.
If you mentioned fair price, I would like to ask you what is the fair price of the euro? meaning you mentioned several times inflation, central bank, ECB, and I think that one of the core issues, if we speak about the impact of war on Europe, that what will be the interest rate and how it will affect, and what do you think, to take the question a bit broader, there are now two huge conflicts inside Europe. One is about the interest rate of the euro, because either the German citizens will lose their savings or Italy will go into bankruptcy. And the other conflict is about buying Russian gas or not, because the landlocked and oil, because the landlocked countries cannot diversify, or if they diversify, they would need some really expensive compensation for doing it, but no one seems to accept this compensation issue at all. But these are two huge economic conflicts. Maybe you can list some others. I'm curious if you can. And my question is not how politics can solve it. This is the business for politicians, and it's a panel on economics. But how can the economic forces, those beautiful invisible hands that we have 5 or 6 with us now, how can economic forces help to solve somehow these deep conflicts of European economy?
Yeah, I'm going to focus on the first point in particular. I think it is true that at the moment, obviously, when the ECB entered the tightening cycle, of course, they had to do it in a very different manner from what other central banks have done. So they have to increase interest rates, but at the same time, they had to guarantee sort of investors in terms of their willingness of holding Italian BTP or sort of peripheral bonds. The only way to do it was indeed to put in place a sort of permanent facility which would enable the European Central Bank to buy sovereign bonds. Now, of course, this is a very controversial topic. Many people do not like the transmission protection mechanism that has been created. I'm one of them. I don't think it's a good idea. I mean, in the way it is designed, but I think this is probably for another panel. But I think there is a very clear conflict at the moment, in the sense we're entering a tightening cycle. Interest rates are on the rise. So what role should fiscal policy have? I mean, we've seen recently the example of the UK, where essentially the budget that was issued last Friday was very much dubbed as a sort of fiscal dominance problem, because of course that forced the Bank of England possibly to increase interest rates much more, to go to the market and buy gilts and guarantee that pension funds will not melt down because of course financial markets were panicking. And of course that has to do a lot with the credibility at the moment of the monetary and fiscal mix, which is very delicate, because again, as interest rates will go up, clearly this will make that sustainability. We have now countries with huge amounts of debt. I mean, after the pandemic, we had to ensure business continuity. We have to pay furlough schemes. So debt levels are at an all-time high. I think for the average advanced economy is probably 100% of GDP, and this is quite a big number. So the idea is that, of course, we will have to think about debt sustainability. We will have to rethink about the role of fiscal policy. And for the euro, I mean, you're absolutely right. There is a very important tension. I mean, let's not forget the euro itself is built on one central bank and 19 treasuries, and this is a very special setup, which is not present in the UK, is not present in the United States. So basically, the government issues debt, to quote Paul de Grauwe, issues debt in a currency that they can control. So if the government in England want to sort of issue debt, the Bank of England will always buy debt. In the Eurozone, it's a bit more complicated, because of course, if Italy issues debt, then that would be issued in euros, and if the ECB buy that debt, that would automatically have a redistributive effect within the euro, because of course any insolvency on Italy would be redistributed across euro member states. So there is an intrinsic fragility of the euro which has not been resolved. The European Recovery and Resilience Fund does not answer that because it's a sort of one-off. And just for the benefit of the audience, this was kind of a 750 billion program that was put in place in response to the pandemic, but mainly to tackle long-term challenges such as energy transition and greening, sort of digital transition and greening of the economy, so very long-term growth potential. So there are a lot of questions which are left unanswered in the euro in terms of monetary and fiscal policy interactions. And I think for the future, I mean, a very serious question is, the sustainability of the euro itself will never be there unless we agree to sort of a fully fledged fiscal union, which again will require probably a political whim to speak with a single voice, which obviously is not there. And we have already discussed in previous panels. A lot of countries within the euro do not speak with a single voice, and it's a lot of internal fighting. We've seen that.
Yeah, I would broadly agree with all that. I think, I mean, we had the European sovereign debt crisis exactly 10 years ago, already coming from the fact that we have one single currency for many different countries. Some of them, like Italy or Spain, would like much lower rates than what the ECB sets. Some countries willing much higher rates than what the ECB sets, like Germany or Netherlands. And somehow none of those issues have been really fixed. And the divergence in terms of real situation, in terms of the price level, in terms of the labor market, in terms of fiscal policy, there was no convergence, and if anything, there is even more divergence than ever. So that's clearly a threat to the euro over the next few decades. And the risk is that, in principle, at least as economists, we like to think of the central bank's role as a role in terms of economics, in terms of, we like theories about a natural rate of interest, or about a Taylor rule, or about all of the reasons why we want the policy rate to be higher or lower. What is likely to happen more and more if these divergences remain as they are, or if they widen, is that the fixing of the interest rate by the ECB becomes increasingly political. It has already been extremely political over the past 10 to 15 years. It's very clear that most of what the ECB has done over the past 10 to 15 years is not necessarily because the ECB always thinks it's best in terms of economics. There is also issues of saying, well, if we let one country fail, then perhaps it's the end of the euro, or perhaps it's going to weaken the euro or the eurozone considerably. And so political fixing of interest rates was already partly there, either through the rate policy per se or through other policies like quantitative easing, like other policies. And it's likely to become, I guess, even more and more political. Of course, the risk is that as the fixing of the interest rate becomes increasingly political, any decision is increasingly seen as being favoring one country and being detrimental to some other countries. And so there is really a risk here of fragmentation of the Eurozone. There are theoretically some policies that could be put in place in terms of fiscal policies and so on, but we are kind of very far from that, and I'm not sure that the war in Ukraine brings us closest to those solutions. If anything, it's exactly the opposite.
Thank you very much. Someone has some question more? If no, then thank you very much. I hope then in 2050 we can sit down and discuss that book, and we can check what will be there from the today discussed issues. Thank you very much. Thank you for the audience.